Lord Jesus, you fasted 40 days and 40 nights in perfect holiness as part of your act of obedience for our justification. Give to us responsible and thankful response by way of discipline in our sanctification through the omnipotent might of Jesus. Amen. Well, we're 1538. We're talking about the closing of the monasteries with Canon Dixon, Volume 2 in the history of the Church of England. So we pick up there on 112. The terrible doctor then proceeded to deliver his long meditated attack upon the town of Coventry, where in an assault which lasted 2 days, he dissolved the cathedral priory, the noble foundation of Leofric and Godeva, of 25 Benedictines and £700, and the house of the unwise Carthusians, a prior and 8 monks whose income barely raised them above the degree of a lesser monastery. Nor failed he, it is probable, to take in his course the compliant Cistercians of the neighboring house of Combe, 14 of number, on whom he had fixed already a longing eye. Their income was above £300 a year. Some footnotes. The surrender. Peach,
what?
Could you get me some ice water?
Sure, Grandpa.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
He's studying here in Princeton. The surrender of Hyde was completed in London in the autumn. There are, or nearly are, all in Burnet's list also, and in the 8th record report. So of all the other houses throughout the suppression, I may add that my knowledge of the annual revenues of the monasteries had been readily acquired from the pages of the valuable Tanner. I've kept to round numbers and sometimes struck a balance between Dugdale and Speed, the latter whom exceeds the former in his estimation of incomes. And for as much as Combe is so nigh unto,
There you go, Grandpa.
Thank you,
You're
unto
welcome.
Coventry, the abbot with all his friends at your lordship's pleasure, I should be glad to go through that house also. All the sort of them do look duly for their departing, and therefore make their hands by leases, sales of wood, and of their plate. I suppose this abbot will leave his house and lands like an honest man. London to Cromwell, December 1538. The well-reputed nunnery. A Polesmith fell before him next, where 14 black ladies maintained themselves on £90 a year. He smoked the Carmelite and the Minorite that were in Nottingham to the number of 7 and 8 in one day. Dr. Tregonwell and Dr. Petre ran together the race of the swift. The former took Bradenstroke in Wiltshire, a house of 14 Austin canons of a little more than £200 a year. In Somersetshire, he dissolved Kinsham, another Augustinian house of 10 persons, of double the value, in the Cathedral Church of Bath, a Benedictine foundation, which had been returned in the Valor Ecclesiasticus 4 years before, at the revenue of 1,800, but was now so reduced by alienations or the expedition of the monks as to yield no more than 700. He disdained not the 2 small hospitals of St. John the Baptist in Wells and Bridgewater, 2 other brotherhoods, they of 4 and 8, and pursuing his way through the same county, he destroyed Athelney, a Benedictine house of 9. A footnote here, sends some one of his trusty servants to me at my being there, to receive the house with all other reckonings to my lord's use, the goods being indifferently appraised. He cannot have a more commodious house, and the longer he tarrieth, the worse everything will be. So universally they make their hands all they can that as yet remain unsuppressed. And it's got a list here, London's career before Parliament, 1539, Stixwold, Friars of the Dominicans of Derby, the 15th, Benedictines of Coventry, 16th, Carthusians of Coventry, Combe, Wright, Polesworth, White Friars or Carmelites of Nottingham, Grey Friars or Minors, or Cordeliers or Franciscans of Nottingham. Tregonwell's career before Parliament, the two Austin houses of Buckland and of Taunton, the former a nunnery, the latter the abode of a prior, and 12 monastic canons, all exceeding £200 of revenue. Passing into Devonshire, he dissolved the Cistercians of Donkswell of 10 persons and £300, and the site of their house was given to the newly created Lord Russell. He struck down Canon Lee and Hertland, both of the Augustinian order, the one of 2, the other of £300. The smaller the abode of 18 nuns, the larger of no more than 4 canons and an abbot. 3 more establishments of the same extensive association fell before him next in Cornwall, the priories of Lancaston, of Bodmin, and of St. Germain, all about the same number of 8 or 9 black canons, in income all about £300. Returning into Devonshire, he found a richer prey and an older one, and at Tavistock the abbot and 20 black or Benedictine monks resigned an income of £900 and a superb abode, the site of which was conceded to the favored Russell. He omitted not the smaller Cistercian house of Nome of the value of £250 a year, nor in the neighboring Dorsetshire the priory of Bindon of the same order, a somewhat inferior value, a convent of 8 persons. In the latter county he was rewarded by an ampler spoil. The 3 great Benedictine establishments of Middleton, Cerne, and Shaftesbury fell before him, of the respective revenue of 7, of 3, and £1,300, composed the 2 former of 13 and 17 religious men, the last the famous nunnery of unknown number, which had lately suffered to a suffragan bishop, the title of his office. In Wiltshire he dispatched Wilton, another Benedictine nunnery, 12 ladies and £600, and paused in a distinguished career among the less opulent Carthusians of Hinton and Somersetshire, where 20 monks subsisted on an income of £250. In his labors at Bath and at Buckland, Tregonwell was associated with no less eminent Dr. Petre, but the two, being engaged in the same region of the southwest, appear to have avoided one another so far as was possible, and the advance of the one was the signal of the retirement to the other. In one day, St. Peter brought down St. John's Hospital in Exeter of the Austin order, consisting of 4 priests. I've got some footnotes here. John Bradley, abbot of Milton, was consecrated bishop suffragan of Shaftesbury, 1538. He was also commendatory of Middleton and now surrendered it to Tregonwell. It's got a list of all these places that were surrendered that we just read. Of course, barristers 12, poor £100, and the Benedictine nunnery of Polstow in Devonshire of the lesser value. In the same county, the houses of Torre, Buckfast, Buckland, and Plimpton of the Premonstratensian, the Cistercian or Augustinian orders, with their heads and convents ranging from 10 to 20 monks, yielded in succession the generous prizes of 4, of 5, of 3, and of £900 a year. In Somersetshire, he put an end to the charter house of Witham, the original seat of an obstinate and detestable order, which scarcely rose above the value of a little one. But returning swiftly to Devonshire, he captured Ford, where 12 Cistercians existed, prey of double worth. In Dorsetshire, he emulated the deeds of Tregonwell by the expulsion of the Benedictines of Abbotsbury and Sherburn, the latter an ancient bishopric. In numbers, they were 11 and 17, their annual incomes of £500 and £600. Somersetshire, he dispatched the Cluniac Abbey of Montague, of similar value, 14 in convent. In 2 successive days, he scattered the Austin canons of Eddington and Bruton and Wiltshire. Another list at the bottom. Besides the industry of these great men must be enumerated the fall of Brushard Nunnery in Suffolk, where 9 minoresses or minoresses and sisters of the small order of St. Clare resigned to visit her cave, a revenue of £50, and witness the concession of their site and their endowments to one Nicholas Hare. Tarrant, a Cistercian nunnery in Dorsetshire, consisting of an abbess and 18 nuns, surrendered a more opulent patrimony of the annual return of £350 to one John Smith, and became immediately the reward of the merit of Sir Thomas Wyatt. The Benedictines of Warwick, 12 in number, and their prior, the defamed Premonstratensians or White Canons of Cockersand and Lancashire, convent of an abbot and 22 religious with 57 servants, both renounced their existence before some unknown visitors, the later relinquishing the not inordinate income of £280. To these miscellaneous surrenders may be added the white monks, Carthusians of Tower Hill, and minoresses without Aldgate, about the revenue of £300. The suppression, it will be evident, had proceeded to great lengths with greater and lesser monasteries alike since the last session of the last Parliament, which granted the lesser houses only to the king. 3 years, indeed, of indiscriminate plundering or transference, a sacrilege or unresisted resumption had now rolled over. It was time, it was now prudent, to rebuild the legal sanctuary. The writs for a general election were issued in the spring. No opposition was expected. The work to be done was but the regular and unexciting toil of gainful slavery, but still no pains were spared by Cromwell and the court to collect such a body of legislators as might be worthy to continue the course of their predecessors. And Cromwell's secretary, Morrison, was charged with the office of answering in the Commons for the Crown if any objection had been brought against the late measures. The Houses met at the end of April after the celebration of the usual Mass and an humble prayer for divine direction. The Lord Chancellor read the speech from the throne, from which it appeared that the great business before them was still ecclesiastical, and above all, the calming of any agitation or bewilderment. Footnote: Mr. Froude has related the history of this election, how the Earl of Southampton went around the south of the country, how Cromwell dictated the choice of Oxford and of Canterbury. Amongst others, for your graces, Parliament, I have appointed your Majesty's servant, Mr. Morrison, to be one of them. No doubt he shall be ready to answer and take up such as would crack or face with literature of learning, or by indirect ways, if any such shall be, as I think there shall be few or none. It shall be. Your master had never a more tractable Parliament. Cromwell to Henry, 17 March, State Papers. So 17 March, but which is it 1539? I think it is. Fell of late in a smooth uniformity of opinion. The course also which the legislators might take seemed to have been sketched out for them. His Majesty desires, said Audley, above all things, that diversity of religious opinion should be banished from his dominions. This is the workup, I think, to the 6 articles. Since this is a thing too arduous to be determined in the midst of so many judgments, it seems good to him to order a committee of the upper house to examine opinions and to report their decisions to the whole Parliament. The committee was chosen, consisted of the vicegerent, that would be Cromwell, the 2 archbishops like Cranmer, and I think it's Lee up in York, and the bishops of Bath, Ely, Worcester, Bangor, Durham, and Carlisle, who withdrew themselves that they might pursue their labors without molestation. All but the vicegerent, who appears modestly to have relinquished the discussion of theology to the appointed prelates. But a conclave composed so equally of the old and new learning was more likely to exhibit than to allay the diversity which the king disliked. The business of the session proceeded in the House. Day followed day, but no message of agreement came from the chamber of the disputants. And at length the Duke of Norfolk, to whom more than to Cromwell was now confided the task of maintaining the royal interest, rose and propounded to the Lords another scheme already matured by the court. The embryon which was presented developed into the formidable body of the 6 articles. 10 days have elapsed since spiritual peers were assigned to examine the diversity of opinions concerning religion in this realm of England. It has seemed doubtful from the first whether they would ever come to an agreement. Let then the matters in dispute be determined openly and freely in full Parliament, and let a penal statute be passed against all those who shall transgress the settlement so made. How's that? Theology by the hermeneutics of Parliament. These matters may be digested into 6 articles as follows: whether the Eucharist be the very body of our Lord without transubstantiation, whether the Eucharist ought to be administered to the lay people under both kinds, whether by divine law vows of chastity ought to be observed. And it's going to be the passage of this that requires Tom Cranmer to pack up his wife, Marguerite, and I think that there's 2 kids at this point. I believe he packs her up and has to send her to Germany. And also, Shaxton, Bishop Shaxton and Bishop Latimer will resign their episcopal sees over this, men of conscience. The question arises, why did Tom Cranmer do that? I think somewhere he gives a reason that because he was in a high position and he could continue to advocate for a reformation, and he will argue in Parliament against these 6 articles. Precisely what his relationship to all of that was. He's still basically a realist, holding to the corporal and carnal view of the sacrament. Whether by divine law vows of chastity ought to be observed, whether private masses be to be retained by divine law, whether by law divine priests may have wives, whether auricular confession be by divine law a thing of necessity. Hereupon the committee appears to have been recalled, and a long debate ensued in the House of Lords, conducted solely by the bishops. Cranmer, Latimer, Shaxton, Goodrich, Barlow, and the less advanced Heath, now Rochester, stood on the one side. On the other, Lee, Gardner's back in it, Tunstall, and Aldrich of Carlisle. The temporal lords kept silence, and it was particularly observed at this crisis neither Cromwell nor Audley, the new men who owed all to the revolution, they didn't speak either. On the 3rd day of the debate, the victory was decided by the arrival of reinforcements so powerful that opposition died before it. The king himself entered the house and carried his orthodoxy so fiercely that the new learning was effectually routed. The only prelate who remained obstinate was the determined Shaxton, who now showed a spirit which afterwards deserted him. Cranmer, Latimer, Barlow yielded, and the silent laymen, in a sudden animation, showed that their hearts and votes were with their sovereign Lord. Some footnotes here. Absque transubstantiation. It's difficult to understand the expression. Perhaps it means without considering the process, the quae modo, whether it be transubstantiation or otherwise. The honors of this discussion are usually given to Cranmer by the historians, who speak as if he had been on his legs the 3 whole days arguing against the 6 articles. This comes out of Fox. It's going to footnote will continue on the next page. So back at it here, nor was his majesty unmindful of the other suggestion of his duke to have his unity of religion enforced by penal statutes. 10 days after his appearance among them, he sent to the lords a message by the Lord Chancellor, quote, that whereas both he and the spiritual peers had studied and toiled until they had got to a settlement upon the preceding 6 articles, it was his royal will that a penal statute should be made to compel his subjects to observe and to prohibit them from gainsaying the unity thus determined, or dissenting from it, but that he left the form of punishment to them. Close quote. By common consent, 2 committees were appointed to compose and submit to the king 2 forms of penal statute of the kind indicated, the one consisting of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Bishops of Ely and St. David's, and Dr. Petre, the other the Archbishop of York, Bishops of Durham. Another footnote here, talking about Cranmer in Parliament arguing against the 6 articles. Cranmer standing, as it were, post alone against the whole Parliament, disputing and replying 3 days together. Canon Dixon says this is a gross exaggeration of Fox's original Maurice. See Nichols' Narratives, page 248. According to a contemporary eyewitness, however, the honor belongs rather to Shaxton. Never prince showed himself so wise a man, so well learned, so Catholic, as the king had done in this parliament. With my pen I cannot express his marvelous goodness, which has come to such effect that we shall have an act of parliament so spirited that I think none shall dare say, in the blessed sacrament of the altar doth remain either bread or wine after the consecration, nor that a priest may have a wife, nor that it is necessary to receive our Maker sub utraque specie, nor that private masses should not be used as they have been, nor that it is not necessary to have auricular confession. And notwithstanding my Lord of Canterbury, my Lord of Ely, my Lord of Salisbury, my Lords of Worcester, Rochester, and St. David's defended the contrary long time, yet finally his Highness confounded them all with God's learning. York, Durham, Winchester, and Carlisle have shown themselves to be honest and well-learned men. We of the temporality have been all of one opinion, and my Lord Chancellor and my Lord Privy Seal as good as we can devise. My Lord of Canterbury and all his bishops have given their opinion and come in to us, save Salisbury, who yet continueth a lewd fool. This is the letter of a member of Parliament found in Strips, Cranmer. So if you disagree with the king and Parliament, you're a lewd fool. Their work was performed within 10 days, and the king perhaps approving the form presented to him by the letter committee. And after a provision had been added by the Commons, the penal statute was passed on 16 June. In other words, you don't hold these 6 articles, you're done. And some people died as a result. Robert Barnes was one. Such was the true opinion of the act celebrated for abolishing diversity of opinions, commonly known as the 6 articles, and termed by the heretics the bloody bill and the whip with 6 strings. It was a new heresy act, proceeding not from the church, though sanctioned as to the doctrine by the Southern Convocation, but from the Parliament and the commandment of a king, and at the instance of a layman. It was made apparently in favor of the old learning at the very moment when the old learning, or at least a large part of it. Another footnote here before we go on. It needs scarcely be said where Fox lays the blame of the 6 articles. They were devised by the cruelty of the bishops, but especially the Bishop of Winchester, and at length subscribed also by King Henry. Fox is followed here by most writers, and it's fair to add that, as we shall see, his opinion concerning Gardner's part in the matter was shared by the contemporary Melanchthon. Mr. Froude says that it was the report of the committee on which Gardner was that was accepted by the peers. It may have been so, but it was not so much a report as a draft or scheme of an act. It would seem to have been accepted by the king before it was accepted by the peers. And here we'll draw this section to a conclusion. The bloody 6 articles of 1539 in merry old England. Let us end. Glory be to the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, now and evermore.